thank you all for quietening down, and welcome to what promises to be a truly fantastic public debate, public panel on geoeconomic power and economic security. I stress public because this is on the record and being recorded, so just be mindful of that. Not looking at anyone in particular. Secretary of State. Anyway, so for those of you who don't know, my name's Gillian Tett. I am both a columnist at the Financial Times. I used to run the FT in America. These days, I'm just a columnist. I also oversee King's College at Cambridge, so I have both hats on today. And I originally trained as a cultural anthropologist. So I have long been fascinated by political economic systems and how they change over time and the cultural aspects of that. And right now, we are in the middle of, in my view, the fourth big zeitgeist shift since 1900 in terms of how we imagine the global political economy. In particular, we've gone from a world which was essentially addicted to the idea of globalization and free market capitalism and innovation. That's a world that most of us grew up in and built our careers in and regard as normal, to a world of geoeconomics and geofinance, which we've seen echoes of before, most notably in the 1920s and 30s, but most of us have not encountered in a meaningful way in our own lives, unless we happen to be living in places like China. So it is a big shock, and I should congratulate the organizers of this panel for their timing for two reasons. The short-term obvious point is that we're discussing these issues as we see a display of geoeconomics in a very real way around the Strait of Hormuz, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that today. More widely, though, I must congratulate Matteo and his group for being way ahead of the curve in terms of diving into these issues 3 or 4 years ago, long before it was fashionable, and creating not just a series of dense economic papers to look at it, read mostly just by other economists, but also some very user-friendly charts and graphs on their webpage, which have been absolutely invaluable for mere journalists like myself trying to make sense of it. So congratulations to all of you on both fronts. So we have a great panel to talk about these themes. I'm not going to waste time with introductions. I think you know most of them very well. At the end, we have H.R. McMaster, someone I admire deeply for having served in the first Trump White House and having served with great integrity and also not got fired, which is a difficult combination. Next to him is...
Well, not right away. I didn't get fired right away. That's what she means.
Well, I stress the point about integrity because right now that is a very valued commodity. Next to him is Maurice Obstfeld, an economist I've admired for many years who's written a lot about these themes for a long time, again, way before it was fashionable. Next to him, someone I don't need to introduce, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, 66 Secretary of State, and somebody, I should say, who had a lot of impact on many young women growing up in America, including my own daughters, who actually managed to see for the first time, my own daughter's a mixed race, and seeing her in office had a transformational impact. So I'm forever grateful for you. Never mind the details of what you actually did in office. The very fact you were there was fabulous. And next to me is, of course, Matteo Maggiori, who has been driving this whole project. So we're going to hear from each of the panelists for about 5 to 7 minutes on their thoughts about how to pass the current situation. Is this swing towards geoeconomics a temporary phenomena? Is it more permanent? And if it is more permanent, what does it mean in terms of companies, countries, the economics profession, and much more else? And then we'll have some conversation between us, and then we'll open it up to questions after that. There are microphones here, and I will moderate that later on. But let's start with the panel, first of all. And I believe that, am I supposed to go in this order here in terms of?
Reverse.
So let's
start with the secretary.
Oh, okay, all right, thank you. All right, well, I'll take my orders.
I thought the order was going to be what was on the piece of paper. So,
well, we can start negotiating that if you want.
right, exactly.
Negotiations are all the rage right now.
Yeah,
But maybe
it is,
you,
it
as
is.
someone who's very skilled in negotiation, would you be happy to start?
I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
But let me start not as a former Secretary of State, but as a political scientist who studies how systems work in the international system works. And I think one reason we're starting to have these discussions now about national security and economics in the same room with the same people at the table really is a reflection of how the international system has evolved since World War II. After World War II, the United States and its allies formed what I think was an extraordinary international innovation, particularly when you think about the victorious powers. And what the victorious powers usually did in international politics was victorious powers chose to crush those who had been defeated in the wars. That was certainly the case after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and so forth. And after the World War II, the United States and its allies had a different idea, which was that they would build an international economy that addressed some of the malaise, some of the dysfunction that had led to World War II, including hoping to build an international economy that was not zero-sum. But where through countries not manipulating their currency, through freer trade, through ultimately the free movement of capital, you would be able to have a positive sum international economy where my growth didn't have to come at your expense, where we traded for resources instead of warring over them. And this was quite an extraordinary system, really. It also, by the way, was protected piece by American military power, whether it was the Article 5, an attack upon one is an attack upon all of the NATO treaty, or the defense treaty with Japan, or taking on the defense of South Korea after the Korean War, and ultimately the defense of the sea lanes when Britain and France were no longer able to do so. So international economy that was not zero-sum, and American military protection for it. There was another element to it that sometimes gets obscured, which was it was a big bet on what political scientists have now been able to show, something called the democratic peace. Democracies don't fight one another. And so instead of crushing Germany, you would encourage a democratic Germany, which then would never threaten its neighbors. You would encourage a democratic Japan, which would never threaten its neighbors. So this system is going very well, but actually you never really have to worry about the connection between national security and the international economy, because initially the Soviet Union was completely isolated from this, and so the Soviet Union was a military might, but it was also an economic and technological midget. And so you didn't have to worry too much about the implications of national security for the economy. You could engage in things like COCOM, something that I used to manage, which isolated the Soviet economy by denying it technology through a set of restrictions. Oh, by the way, they were kind of self-isolating because they believed that they didn't want to integrate into the international economy, that they would be vulnerable if they did. So these two trains were going on very separate tracks, a national security side and an economic side. Soviet Union collapses and the countries of the bloc are pulled into the system. But the big change is, of course, in 2001, China is admitted to the WTO. And all of a sudden, this system, which was sort of represented by the G7, started by George Shultz and Ronald Reagan, the G7, the 7 largest economies in the world, they were also all democracies. They were all a part of the American security arrangements. Enter China, not a democracy, not a part of the American security arrangements, benefiting from the international economic peace. And for one moment, if you were in business, you kind of put your supply chains where they were most efficient. You did the investments where the ROI was greatest. You manufactured and you assembled where the conditions were best. And you just painted on a great big canvas because it was kind of one big international economy. As China evolved, however, it took the benefits of integration into that economy and began to challenge instead the American system, challenging in the South China Sea, challenging around Taiwan. And to me, one of the great moments, a kind of hinge point, if you will, Xi Jinping's speech in 2015 that China would surpass the United States in frontier technologies like quantum and AI within 10 years. And oh, by the way, civil-military fusion would mean that those benefits technologically would go to benefit the PLA. At that point, this system really has to bring together national security and economic issues, and that's what we deal with today. And so I'll just stop there, but to note that one reason I think we're having this conversation is that the international system has evolved into one in which it's particularly the world of technology, but also the international economy are more competitive, adversarial, decoupling than at any other time, and certainly not reflective of the system that people had intended in 1945.
Right. So just quickly before I turn to Maurice, so you're essentially saying this is not a short-term blip.
Correct.
This is more of a structural swing.
Absolutely. I'm very often asked, is the Trump revolution a revolution or an evolution? And I always say, look, a revolution is what happens when you don't see an evolution coming. And so I think that what you're seeing are that these are long-term secular trends, not the expression of one administration or another. There may be some acceleration given the fact that this administration at least came to power with a kind of anti-globalist tinge, but these underlying circumstances were there for a long time, including, and I'll just end this with some resentment on the part of the United States that it had carried this security burden for so long. Bob Gates, very much someone who I think people would think of as an Atlanticist, gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference in his last time as Secretary of Defense. He was now in the Obama administration. He was both in Bush and Obama. And he said, I'm the last security official, who has an emotional attachment to NATO and to Europe. It's going to become a cost-benefit analysis, and you will be found wanting. That from Bob Gates, who was, if anything, someone who defended the system. So,
Well, that resentment is no longer muted. It's on full display every morning in the wee hours on Truth Social right now. Yeah. So, Maurice, would you agree with that?
I very much agree with those comments, and I'll put a different spin on them less eloquently. I have some quotes, and so I have some notes. But if you look back in history, security policy, foreign policy, economic policy have always been linked. The idea that this is something novel to our age is dead wrong. The period from roughly 1990 to about 20 years later, in which some of you in this audience have mostly lived, is a true anomaly in history. And I think we've really returned to form now with what we're experiencing. Now, as a way of illustrating, the great heritage of linking these security issues with economic policy, I can't do better than quote one of the deepest and most influential thinkers in this area, who is Alexander Hamilton. So he wrote two very important reports when he was Secretary of the Treasury. First of all, the report on manufactures, where he said not only the wealth, but the independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufacturers. Now, in this, he was opposed by many in the New Republic, including the first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who thought that an economy that was mostly agrarian, part of it based on slavery, was doing just fine, obeying its comparative advantage. They had all read Smith by that point. But Hamilton had a different view. And, he proposed tariffs, nothing like the Trump tariffs, and he was not enthusiastic about them. The second great link between security and the economy was through the public credit. So Hamilton also created the national debt, again, over Jefferson's objection. They made a famous deal whereby Washington, D.C. is located where it is, near Virginia, establishing what was effectively a central bank. And again, Hamilton wrote that countries need good credit. If you have a war, you need to borrow. So the sort of financial sinews, the manufacturing sinews were things that he wanted to build and he viewed as essential. And I would argue that the Trump administration recognizes some of these points. For example, they talk about the importance of manufacturing, but they're going about its support in exactly the wrong way, and they're not succeeding. Regarding the financial infrastructure of the US, on which, in fact, the world economy depends, in many ways, they're acting to wreck it through undermining the Fed, through unwise financial deregulation, through unrestrained fiscal deficits. So these are problems going forward. Secretary Rice talked about the emergence of the multilateral system after World War II. This, I would agree, was very farsighted at the time. It appears even more farsighted today in light of the collective action problems that have arisen since, say, 1944 that we couldn't have anticipated then. Nuclear proliferation, global pandemics on a scale which we haven't seen since after World War I, climate, cybersecurity, and the challenges from globalization. All of these require multilateral approaches to problems. The problem that we encountered is that the system, the multilateral system, the globalized system, was not really stable. And the big fly in the ointment was the rise of China, a revisionist power that became very powerful thanks to the workings of this system. I would argue that this administration has no strategy to deal with this in a non-conflictual way. A couple of years ago, Kevin Rudd, who was the prime minister and ambassador, wrote a very nice book called The Avoidable War, 2022, where he listed Xi Jinping's dream scenario. Like, what would Xi Jinping like to see by, say, 2030? And if you go through this list, China's getting a lot closer to their dream scenario than we are to ours. I'm not even sure what our dream scenario is, but this includes securing his political position domestically, creating the largest consumer market in history, peeling Europe and other parts of the world away from the US, becoming the largest source of finance and the leader of the multilateral system. The US, using the tools of statecraft that it's using, which are largely predatory, coercive, violate treaties, alienate our allies, is not going to be able to win this contest. And unless there's a change of course, I don't see us coming out even with China, like even. So I don't think we go back to the system we had. The question is, what kind of system can we construct that would be an acceptable system for us as a country, for other free nations as a country? I think one of our biggest obstacles is internal to that. I ask whether a nation as polarized as we are, with the nasty politics we have, can actually act as a great power on the world stage. And here Hamilton had another quote from the early 1780s. He was commenting on the situation in the US with the Articles of Confederation, but it really resonates today. There is something noble and magnificent in the perspective of a great federal republic closely linked in the pursuit of a common interest, tranquil and prosperous at home, respectable abroad. But there is something proportionately diminutive and contemptible in the prospect of a number of petty states with the appearance only of union, jarring, jealous, and perverse, without any determined direction, fluctuating and unhappy at home, weak and insignificant by their dissensions in the eyes of other nations. Stop there.
Thank you. Well, that's quite a mic drop. And it's very interesting. I've been in Washington the last couple of days at the IMF World Bank spring meetings, and along the way spent time in the USTR, which is very much taking that Hamiltonian vision as their lodestar of what they're trying to achieve right now. So Hamilton is back in fashion in every sense, both in policy terms and in a wider term, but maybe not quite the full Hamilton, maybe only part of it. Anyway, I'll come back to that in a moment. Before we do, HR, McMaster, How does this look to you? Because, you know, you're not trained as an economist, and yet suddenly your world is now colliding and intermixing very deeply with economics, as we just heard from Secretary Rice.
Right, and I'm trained as a historian too, and it does my heart so much good to hear Maurice quoting Alexander Hamilton and Condi, a political scientist, talking about history too. I love that. So what I'd like to do is just maybe pick up on where Condi and Maurice left off, and agree with both of them about the stakes and kind of how we got there. I think the fundamental issue of our time is a competition essentially between our free market economies, the free world, our democratic societies and forms of government, and what I would describe as an axis of aggressors, that has really coalesced in recent years after our recognition that our assumptions about the post-Cold War era turned out not to be true. And those assumptions, of course, were that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies and our free market economic systems over closed authoritarian systems or statist mercantilist economic models. The great power rivalry and competition was a relic of the past. We would have this condominium of nations that would come together, work together largely under the umbrella of international organizations, work on global issues together. And the third was that our prowess, our technological, our economic, and our military prowess would guarantee our security, well into the future. That kind of bubble burst in the 2000s. And I think we shifted from what I would maybe regard as an over-optimistic view of the post-Cold War world too rapidly to a pessimistic view with a series of strategic shocks and disappointments, which creates, I think, a lot of the polarization that Maurice is talking about. So think about the shock of 9/11, which Condi helped lead us through, but then the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Hey, toss in an opioid epidemic on top of that. How about the effects of social media and pursuing more and more advertising dollars for more and more clicks? Right? And doing so by showing people more and more extreme content and conspiracy theories and so forth. How about the big shifts that happened in the global economy, especially after China's entry into the WTO and the loss of so many manufacturing jobs that left so many Americans behind? And so then these Americans are left behind. They're looking at, hey, what are we worried about European security for? Europe is 19% of the world's GDP, 50% of the world's social spending. Right, so we're underwriting European social programs, by covering their defense bills, and so all of this is related. It's related to some of these disappointments that many Americans encountered, and has led, I think, to the perception in our own country, and a recognition that we're polarized and pitted against each other in ways that are profoundly unhealthy and unproductive. But our adversaries saw this as well, and you know what emboldens the axis of authoritarians, and I'm talking about two revanchist or revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia, who pulled into the fold the theocratic dictatorship in Iran, the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world in North Korea, and people like Maduro and the Cuban army regime. What emboldens them is the perception of weakness. And they saw the West, they thought, hey, they're weak, they're decadent, they're divided. This is our time now. That's the 2015 speech. That's Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, declaring their undying love for each other, right? The partnership with no limits right before the Beijing Olympics, right before the massive reinvasion of Ukraine. Just a few months after the disastrous, deadly, what I would describe as self-defeat and humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. Weakness is what provoked them. The message that they put out in their joint statement was, hey, this is a new era of international relations. Basically, we're in charge now, you're done, get used to it. And they came together again in 2023. Not coincidentally, around the time when we were having a hard time sustaining support for Ukraine after that massive reinvasion. And they talked about how they're seeing changes as Xi Jinping, Vladimir, we're seeing changes like we haven't seen in 100 years. And you and I are driving them, and Vladimir's like, damn straight, Xi Jinping, we are, And then, of course, what you get is Ayatollah Khamenei sitting in Tehran. He's like, you're looking at his to-do list. Well, I've got this thing, destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. Maybe now it's time to do that. And so he was able to assemble, relatively unfettered, the ring of fire around Israel, and he lit that ring of fire on October 7, 2023. So now what? I'm more optimistic than Maurice because I think this axis of aggressors, based on this perception of weakness, are all overextended. I think Maduro got a little bit out over his skis, right? When he started pulling in all the cartels and thinking, hey, the United States isn't going to do anything to me. Yeah, I think Russia, got a little bit ahead of themselves in the 1 week offensive in Ukraine as they packed their dress uniforms in their armored vehicles for the parade in Kyiv. I would say that Ayatollah Khamenei really blew it, not only for his own life, but what happened to his country after lighting that ring of fire, and after Israel did everything we told them not to do, frankly, and kicked the stool out from under Assad, decapitated and decimated Hezbollah, and then with the direct attacks on Israel in 2024, in April and October, they really made another big mistake and invited, they reaped the whirlwind for that with the 12-day campaign, Operation Midnight Hammer, and now the sustained campaign against Iran. It's clear, obviously, from what's going on, and we'll probably talk a little more about this, Gillian, is that the importance of integrating economics with military power, with diplomacy, integrating all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to advance our objectives. And I think if we can do this effectively, if we can take a geoeconomic, geopolitical approach that is fundamentally sound at this moment, we can help bring our free and open societies and free market economies into a greater degree of cooperation. It'd be nice to stop, the gratuitous insults, and threatening to invade Greenland, or take over the Panama Canal. I mean, and the Canadians. Why are we picking on Canadians? Come on. So we should stop that, and then what we can do is, I think, reap the tremendous benefits of our free market economies, because I do see big vulnerabilities in each of these authoritarian regimes. We know that the Russian economy is in a shambles, right? Over 1 million dead and seriously wounded. And China, if that's the model, how are they doing? I think in their race to surpass us, they have created real vulnerabilities in their economy. So if we can come together, I think if we can prevail, which I would say a fundamental change in the nature of the Iranian government, such that it ceases its permanent hostility, to the great Satan, the cancerous boil Israel and their Arab neighbors, then we could see a very significant geopolitical and geoeconomic shift in favor of the free world, in favor of our free market economies. How much influence will China and Russia have left in the Middle East after that happens? Zero. Because their main argument was, you need us because the U.S. is unreliable as a guarantor of your defense, and you need us as a check on Iranian aggression. So that was, I think, the main reason. Okay, so what do we do about it? Just quickly, I have 5 I's, because we have to recognize, as Connie pointed out, that China's statist mercantilist model has been weaponized against us. The first is to insulate our own economies, our free market economies, from Chinese economic aggression. And what I mean by that is really the campaign of trying to get exclusive grip on critical supply chains and use those for coercive purposes, as well as having so much of the world's manufacturing artificially concentrated on the southeastern coast of China, as well as a whole range of other unfair trade and economic practices, including espionage and so forth. And so we have to employ tools of economic statecraft to do that. We worked on a paper on that. Matteo advised us and made sure that the washed-up general didn't put anything really stupid in the paper. But we have to be able to apply those tools. And as Maurice is alluding to, how about in a sensible manner? That would be nice, and maybe semi-consistent even. Okay, so I won't go there. So the second, the I, is incentivize. We have to incentivize investments, mobilize capital, such that we can not only reduce our vulnerability to economic coercion, but sustain and grow our competitive advantages in areas that are particularly important, right? AI, the energy security associated with AI, for example. Connie mentioned these sectors, quantum, and all the areas, that are really critical and competitive for security and for prosperity. The third is I just put immigration in here, but it's really human capital. We should have access to the best minds in the world, right? People aren't immigrating to China. That's our biggest competitive advantage, So let's stop getting in our own way about that. Work on education, work on developing our workforce, which we have to do from a vocational training perspective, the chip factories in Arizona and Texas and Ohio and so forth. But human capital and immigration is part of that. The fourth I, integrate. Integrate geopolitics into all decision-making, public and private. I think if you're on a board, I think if you're in in a C-suite in a company, or if you're looking at investments, you should take a Hippocratic oath. Do no hurt or harm in 3 areas. Don't help the Chinese Communist Party develop the weapons that they might use to kill your kids and grandkids. 1. These are investments in companies like Ford Paradigm, which we invested in, now does all the battlefield cyber tools for the People's Liberation Army. The second would be, don't help them extinguish human freedom. Investments in Hikvision and SenseTime come to mind. Some people got some great returns. Hey, congratulations. I personally think genocide, cultural genocide, should be like an ESG issue. The third would be, don't jeopardize the long-term viability of your company in exchange for short-term gains, right? How many companies go through this? Hey, the promise of access to the Chinese market, cheap manufacturing. Then what do? They steal your IP. They pick a Chinese winner. They subsidize that winner. They shut you down out of their market. They produce the goods at artificially low prices, dump them on the international market, and run you out of business. Doesn't sound like a sound way to do business for me. Anyway,
right. And the last I?
The last why, internationalize. This gets to Maurice's point. This takes all hands on deck across the free world, free market economies. Sorry, that's it.
No,
It doesn't get carried away a little bit.
That's a pretty punchy memo. I hope that's your next book, is all I can say. And it gives a whole new meaning to the concept of 5 eyes. Just very briefly, before I do, as someone I did my own PhD in Soviet Tajikistan, when it was still Soviet Tajikistan, lived there for a number of years. So I'm sort of I was deeply immersed both in the Russian-speaking world and the Persian speaking world. I'm just curious, yes, they are overextended. Many people might say America's overextended right now. Yeah. What would you say to that?
Well, I would,
I can see that.
I would say talk to the economists at the Hoover
Institution. It's not
Institution.
even close, right? It's not even close. The breadth and depth and capacity of the United States to continue to innovate, the ability of the private sector to do that, the abundance that the United States enjoys in energy, for instance, particularly if we could stop being mad at the Canadians, and a democratic society that, for all of its problems, still produces the best and the brightest in the world, is not Vladimir Putin's Russia. And I spent a lot of time with Vladimir Putin. I spent a lot of time in Vladimir Putin's Russia. This has become a war economy that has nothing going for it but discounted oil and arms manufacturing. And the smartest people left Russia in the first few days of that war. So not even close. I might just say to the overextension
Please do,
piece,
by the way.
right?
I partly tossed that question out, partly to provoke you both, but anyway. And it worked.
To the overextension issue, while Vladimir Putin has been chasing the Donbass, he has watched Syria go down, and his friend Bashar al-Assad is in exile, and his bases are gone. He has watched his friend Maduro go to an American prison, and the Cubans have been kicked out of Venezuela, and the Cubans are trying to make a deal with the Trump administration. And Iran, we can go there later. So I think while Vladimir Putin has been trying to recreate the Russian Empire, a few things have been happening to Russia's geostrategic claim to be a great power.
Absolutely. Let's turn to economics. No pressure, Matteo. And then we'll come back to these questions in a moment. I'm sure we're going to have questions about Iran. But how do you frame it right now? And can I ask a question, which you may be touching on, which is that if you believe, as Maurice said, that the period from 1990 through to, let's say, 2007 was the aberration, not the norm, much of the modern economics profession has developed its vision of what economics is in that period. And all these gloriously wonderful models that we've been all trained to use, which assumed that economics was a self-contained, closed thing that you could actually model by using the tools of physics and math because it was so consistent and unpolluted by real-world events. All of those tools were developed really in that period when you had a collision of free market thinking with technological innovation that put the ability to compute things into everyone's pocket for the first time. Do we need to radically rethink economics today?
That's a great question. So, first, I very much agree with Maury that if you look at the long arc of history, the period that I grew up in is definitely a very special period. It's not the absence of these issues. It's a particular incarnation of these issues where the US leadership, very much as Secretary Rice pointed out, decided to offer a deal of the rest of the world, which was come and work with us, integrate with us. We will not bully you. We will not use it short-term for gains. You can trust us and integrate. These issues are now, on the table. Like the WTO was part of this, the IMF, the Modi was in the leadership of, was part of this. That period was pretty special. And it's not the typical deal that a winning power offers. Now, in part, it was offered in the absence of an economic competitor, precisely because Russia was so decoupled economically from the rest of the world. You could do export controls on a few materials, like cocoa. You had to worry about them militarily, but you didn't have to worry about the economics. With China, is very different. We now have a competitor that is incredibly intertwined with the US, and right or wrongly, we're revising these issues. Now, I'm going to get to the economics profession, but one way to think about this is the last time that economists thought incredibly deeply about this, it was a very depressing time. So if you think we're going back, it's not good news. The thought leader on this was Albert Hirschman, who is a young German Jew who escaped into southern France when Paris was occupied by the Nazis. By the way, helped some of the best intellectuals like Marc Chagall and Ayn Rand emigrate to the US, then left, arrived at Berkeley, and wrote what is considered probably the best book on this to this time. Now, the book was about Nazi Germany weaponizing its economy in the lead up to World War II. So if you think that that's the last time we had to think about it hard, that's not good news for all of us. We are thinking about this hard again, and I would argue that the tools that we developed in economics in the last 50 years are actually incredibly useful for thinking about this, because we can adapt them and we can think in new ways of how to incorporate dependency. Let me make an obvious case. So when I teach MBAs here or undergraduates, the typical case for free trade is good, is you and I, me and Secretary Rice, specialize in different things. We both get very good at what we do, and then we trade with each other. But hidden in that argument, each one of us is not good at the thing that we didn't specialize on. And if we can hold each other up, then we have no alternative. So what you're seeing right now is a rethink of the same argument that we put forward to the gains of globalization, and thinking maybe we want to trace it back a little bit. In some circumstances, we want to be more reliant on the domestic economy or on a friend economy and scale it up. And I think part of the point of having these public events is not just to complain about how bad the world is and just get miserable, that we all do when we open the news in the morning. It's just to start thinking about what can we do to make it better? How do we have to think about these issues? And so I'm going to start with two problems, and then I'll get into things that I feel strongly, even if they might sound somewhat naive right now, given the political atmosphere. I think it belongs to all of us to move this conversation forward. So think about two sectors. Think about finance. So Maurice mentioned on this from thinking about Hamilton and saying, look, a lot of what we're doing about the basic dominance of the US is just terrible. So the US has one enormously strategic asset. We dominate the basic financial infrastructure worldwide. If you get disconnected by basic financial services that the US controls, like correspondent banks to make payments across the world, custody to maintain the assets, that's a very serious issue for you. Right now, there is very little alternative. So you would think this would be on the desk of the president as the number one asset that we have to innovate. It's also a time when the technology is changing. All of you have probably sent a wire around the world. That's a technology from the 1970s. It's just not fit for purpose. So you would think that this would be an enormous conversation. It isn't. Instead, what are we doing? Well, first of all, we're abusing our allies that control part of the system, like the Europeans. So SWIFT, which sends most of the messages worldwide, is a Belgian cooperative. Luxembourg does most of the custody of the assets, including the Russian reserves, together with Belgium. So we're depleting the capital that we need from our allies, and at the same time, for very transactional reasons, rather than innovating on a public good, which is the US infrastructure, we're monetizing with stable coins or crypto, which makes no sense at all. I mean, it makes sense if you're thinking about lining your pockets, but it makes no sense if you're thinking about the future of the country. So that's one example. I'll make another, which are tariffs. So think about the blanket tariffs that we've done. Like HR said, we need to decouple in some areas from China. Yes, those are few and far between. There are few strategic sectors that hopefully economists can highlight. Most trade is totally beneficial, and we should be fine with it. Instead, we're doing blanket tariffs on our allies. We're trying to bully Canada, Europe, Mexico. Those are the countries that you want in your alliance, that you want to have as close as possible to you when you need them to exert power abroad or to defend. So they make no sense. They're also, two of the stated objectives are to decrease the trade deficit. Now, Maurice is the world academic leader in thinking about current account dynamics. I was his student, and I didn't learn much, but I did learn that tariffs do not close the current account deficit. I passed that exam. It just doesn't work. If you think about using tariffs for negotiations, again, it goes back to the issue of size. The US economy is big, it's not that big. So sitting down there, you have Steve Redding, who's the world leader in thinking about the pass-through of cost of tariffs, who pays them, is there any evidence that the foreigners are cutting prices? Again, I'm not gonna put words in his mouth, but my reading of that work is, it's actually surprising how little the foreigners cut prices when we put tariffs. We end up paying them. We can debate whether the US retailers pay them or the US consumer pay them, but there is not a lot of evidence that the foreigners are in a rush to cut prices. So what are you doing? You're annoying everybody for transactional reasons, and particularly your closest allies. So let me go back to the positive side. So what should we be doing? Well, the first thing you need to realize is that the old world order is like being a teenager. Everybody is trying to get out of those years very, very fast until you're old and you think, oh God, that was good. That's what we're learning. We want to go back to that thing. And how do we put it back together? Well, this is permanent. I mean, like the Mark Carney speech at Davos, it's not an accident. Look, the US leadership has lost credibility like never before. If you're a European leader right now, you're thinking, great, even if I get a very sensible next US leadership, I'm going to worry about the next election after that. And if I'm making long-term investments, I have to worry about a repeat of this. Once you break it, it's going to be hard to put together. Now, there's a lot of goodwill and ways to do it, but you have to go back to thinking that restraint, it's a huge source of strength. You want to punish a few actors very, very severely when it's time. If you're invading Ukraine, we want to be able to punish you. We want all of our allies to come in. That means never use it for short-term gains. Never use it against people that have done nothing. Never use it for purely commercial gains. If we don't go back to that restraint, it's going to be very, very difficult to even use it when we should. So I think the importance of allies, it's really understated. And I totally agree on the frustration. Look, I'm European. The last time we were good at this was the Medici Bank. So it's been a few years. But Europe, for all this laziness, for all these things, looks pretty sane, at least for now. And I think, nice prodding of you have to do better. You have to lower some barriers. You have to spend more on defense. I think that makes a ton of sense to me. The last thing I would say is, restraint now seems naive given the political situation we're in, but it can be built. But the politicians reflect, in some sense, the nation. This isn't something that some politician is going to unilaterally think, I'm going to do it. We have to go back to thinking of the value of reputation, the value of doing the right thing as being a national characteristic. And that isn't something that is going to happen without these public conversations. And maybe they only move the balance an epsilon, but that epsilon is pretty valuable. Right. And we just have to build from this.
What's an epsilon?
It's a weird term that the economics tribe uses, which no one else understands.
Yeah. What you're suggesting is it's a good thing I never learned all that economics because now I don't need it anymore. Thank you.
Well, we're close to where Life Amongst the Econ was written close to here, and it captures the tribalism of a lot of the economics profession, which I suspect is going to be forced to be broken down in the coming years. But just before we go to questions, I'd like to ask you, Secretary Rice, and Maurice as well. We had from HR McMaster a fabulous 5-part plan, battle plan, may I say it, around the 5 I's for what needs to be done. Do you have 2 or 3 points that you would want to highlight in terms of positive action steps? We just heard from Matteo as well. If you were in office right now.
One is, I just want to underscore the immigration point that because having access to the best and brightest in the world is one of America's greatest strengths. People are not lining up to immigrate to China. They just aren't. I want to say that I think that this cannot be a one-way conversation. With all due respect to the Europeans, they've got to come this way too. I know it's been rough, and like I didn't like the language about Denmark and so forth and so on. But Matteo, we tried the nice, please pay your fair share, right? I was one of those secretaries who went to Brussels and said, please pay the 2%.
And she's super nice.
And I was super nice about it.
But you mean you didn't threaten to invade Greenland all the way?
No. But what we wouldn't have thought in my talking points was we won't defend you if you don't pay your 2%. That wouldn't have been my talking points. But the combination of some pretty tough talk with the Europeans and Mr. Putin did get their attention. So it's not as if for years the more multilateralist, we love allies, we're trying to work with allies, was always successful. And I'm going to tell you one thing about sometimes the United States has believed there are bad guys out there and we have to try to take care of it. And saying this is not our war is not good language. You can say a lot about, well, we don't like the way you did this, you could have consulted, we'll try to help. But this is not our war. It's not resonating well when Americans are in danger. And it's not resonating well with the Gulf Arabs who are being pounded by the Iranians. And so I love our European allies. I think I'm known as a transatlanticist. But I do think this has to come the other way, too. And there has been some damage done.
I take your point.
From the alliance.
Do you think will NATO survive?
Oh, I think NATO will survive. We're going to have to rethink how NATO works. It's high time. What is the redistribution of responsibility? We have 2 new members in Finland and Sweden who have real capability. The Arctic, which we should have all worried about more. I frankly didn't think I worried about enough as secretary. With those 2 countries and the Baltic states, we have a different way to think about the Arctic. So what I would try to do, if you asked what would I try to do, I would try to get through the unpleasantness that we've had in the last few weeks here. And I would say, let's have a vision for what the transatlantic relationship is going to look like under very different conditions. What are the new assets that we have, including Finland and Sweden? Including a Ukraine that, whatever happens, is going to have the 2nd largest land army in Europe and a very capable, battle-hardened army and very capable defenses and innovation in the defense sector. Even if they're never a member of NATO, their integration now into the way that we train, into intelligence and the like, we have some new assets. Let's now look out there and say, how would we like the future to look?
Right.
Because I think the present is not serving us very well. And I would say, I think the Europeans need to rethink how they're talking about this war.
Well, thank you. Well, as someone who's both American and British, I'm all into trying to get a better transatlantic relationship. And of course, Ukraine, since we're sitting in Silicon Valley, Ukraine is also sitting on the biggest training set anywhere for training the next generation of AI-enabled drones, which is very important. Maury, 2 minutes or 1 minute to quickly tell us what you do on the financial side before we go to questions. And I know we're running a bit behind.
Well, on the financial side, I would try to get the budget under control and stop the attacks on the Fed, which are really, easier.
Good ideas all round.
Certainly, the budget is easier said than done. I think there also needs to be attention to maintaining financial cooperation with the Europeans. This is an area where cooperation has grown up organically since the early 1970s. It's been very fruitful. And I worry that the kind of stablecoin imperialism we're seeing from the US is something that could get out of control. I agree with Matteo there. So I think there needs to be a cooperative discussion about that. I mean, I do agree that the Europeans have to do their part and they have to have a rapprochement with the US at some point. I just don't see it happening with this administration. I don't think it's going to happen. But I think they should definitely be open to it and maybe even planning for it.
Maybe they can have their peace summit in Greenland.
Not a bad idea, by the way.
Exactly. I gather Greenland is lovely in the summer.
But can I just tell you, when I had a conversation with some Europeans about the Greenland situation, and I said, you know, yes, we should have been investing in Greenland. The bases are a mess. We could do that. And they said, oh, yes, you should do that. And I said, and then the economic benefits. And they said, well, we'll have to spread those across Europe. Right? Not the right answer. Again, you do the security and we'll reap the benefits. Our language has got to change about responsibility in the alliance.
Yes. Right, so any questions from the audience? We do have microphones, and I believe, do you want them to come up to the microphones or not?
Sure.
Okay, if you can go to the microphones. It would be courteous but not compulsory to introduce yourself very briefly, and please keep your question extremely short because we are really quite short on time as well. So why don't you start?
Sure. My name is Dustin. I'm a first-year MBA student. Gillian, we actually met at the Aspen Ideas Festival. I'm building a hospital in Ukraine. My question is, first of all, thank you guys all for being here. My question is principally for you, General McMaster, and you, Secretary Rice. As someone who cares deeply about the international world order and the U.S.'s position in the world, I resonate a lot with what you say about the importance of strength and the embarrassment that was the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And any sort of premature rupture of our engagement in Iran would risk a similar type of dynamic. But the big strategic competitor is China. And there is some dynamic where I think you guys know a lot more than me, it would be a mistake to allow for the next decade this to consume our attention. How do you think about the balance between the need to engage, the need to finish the job, but the need to not overextend yourself in such a way that you win the battle and lose the war?
So I think that's a polite way of saying, if you were Secretary of War right now, what on earth would you do?
Hey, just 2 quick points. First of all, I think the competition with China is global. And so in terms of China's efforts to create an exclusionary area of primacy in the Indo-Pacific, but also to create new spheres of influence around the world. Venezuela was the hub of competition for that in Latin America. And I think you're seeing the nexus of that being around Iran and the effect that the Iran's really 47-year-long war against us and others in the region, is principally Israel, but their Gulf neighbors as well, has if that comes to an end, that cuts against China, as I mentioned. And then the second is really what we've been talking about, our alliances, and how, from a military perspective, if that's what the kind of competition you're talking about, 4 deployed capable U.S. joint forces operating as part of capable alliances that where countries invest in their own defense is the best way to prevent war. And of course, as we all know, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. So I would emphasize the role of capable alliances as a response to your question as well.
Yeah, I would only say, look, when you're Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense of the United States, you often find yourself fighting on many fronts simultaneously. The idea that we can only do one thing at a time, I think, isn't reality. And so the importance of making sure that Iran does not believe, or that others do not believe, that it controls access to the Straits of Hormuz is the most immediate problem, and you have to solve that. I do not think that means that you lose sight of Taiwan, for instance. And so I think that, when you're sitting at that desk, you might come in one day and the big ball on your desk says Russia. The next day, the big ball might say Lebanon. And so we've always, as a global power, we have to be able to manage several things simultaneously.
Question.
Hello, I'm Nick Jan. I'm a second year in the business school. I'm Professor Rice, John McMaster. We've corresponded over email, and I'm looking forward to meeting with you guys soon. What I wanted to ask you guys primarily about was, as business school students, a lot of us here are at the MBA program, if we're going to careers in technology or corporations, et cetera, and we have a desire to help in preserving the liberal international order, what can we do to help achieve that if we're not having a career in political science or not having a career in the government? What can we do? Well,
I think you can buy H.R. McMaster's forthcoming book on the 5 Eyes, which I'm gonna prod him into writing no matter what.
That's a very good idea. Look, I think there has never been a more important link between the private sector and national security and the health of the country and the health of American power than at this moment. All of the really important innovation is in the private sector. And so when you are in the private sector, realizing that you are actually a player in the international order, a player in national security, an important element of that is, for me, very important. There's no more, we just do business. We don't get involved in those issues of national security and the like. And I think even that recognition would lead you to ask different questions, to perhaps come to different answers, and to make sure that you stay engaged in those conversations as a private sector actor.
Hey, I'll just say just quickly, don't wait for the political class to help reverse kind of the polarization and that we're seeing not only in our society but with allies and partners. And I think all of us can convene people together for meaningful, respectful discussions about how we work together to build a better future. And if you're become an entrepreneur out of this, is that what you're going for? I mean, as you lead your company, or if you're part of a company, leadership in the private sector, we can all have a role in that. And of course, here at Stanford, that's what the university does as well. So,
question over there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dhaval Shah. I'm a computer science alumni from Stanford. The question I had was about the feelings and the backlash from the citizens of the country we go after. Like when we talk about Greenland, when we talk about Canada, what about the soft aspects of the citizens of that country? They start feeling backlash. And what are your thoughts on that?
How do we persuade the Canadians to like us again?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I do think that in some of these cases, and I think in some ways Canada is a more important example. Look, we have a long-standing relationship with Canada. It's our closest trading partner. It's our closest partner in so many ways. And so, yes, there needs to be some repair with that leadership, but also with the people. And I think if I were doing this, by the way, I would not be so reliant on what the U.S. government does. But it's a little bit to HR's point. It's business interactions, it's university interactions, it's student interactions, because it's I used to be asked all the time, what can Washington do, what can the US government do to deal with our problems of popularity, right? I was asked that all the time. And I would say, great powers aren't always popular. And so actually, I thought public diplomacy was not really, the United States was not that good at public diplomacy. We all hearkened back to Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, but that was a very different circumstance when you had a population that knew they were being lied to in the Soviet bloc and they were looking for alternative voices. That's not the way the world operates now. And so I'll just give you an example. I did sports diplomacy. I sent Michelle Kwan to China. She was on the cover of every magazine. I sent Cal Ripken to the Caribbean. He was on the cover of every magazine. So actually, America in that sense is best represented by its citizenry and by the private sector, not always by the US government. Because frankly, great powers have to do some things that are really unpleasant, and people don't like it. And so if you want to be a great power that is popular, good luck.
Well, of course, back in the 1970s, we had ping pong diplomacy, didn't we? HR, do you comment on that as well? Because I've been told by Matteo that we can go on for a few more minutes. Is that the case, or we can for about 2 or 3 minutes? I'd like to get the last question quickly, but HR,
I would just say, turn the negative into a positive. Condi's already alluded to this. If you care about Arctic security, if you care about invigorating our industrial base and applying new manufacturing techniques and tapping into the great promise of AI and preventing wars, restoring peace, I mean, we have to all do that together, And I think if you look at like the Draghi report, for example, it kind of aligns with Trump's agenda. When you think about what he wants to achieve, sometimes the way he goes about it, is self-defeating, but he wants energy security, he wants deregulation, invigorate the industrial base, he wants what he calls energy dominance. It turns out, hey, energy security is pretty darn important, right? So I think turn the negative into positive. I mean, enough with the, to quote, Oddball from a great movie about tanks. Kelly's Heroes, enough with the negative waves, Moriarty.
Yeah.
Can't you have a righteous thought for a change? So let's do that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Gillian, could I just say one other thing? I should have made the following point, though. Look, when I was Secretary of State, I would go into a room with the American military on one shoulder and the American economy on the other. Right? The idea that you can conduct diplomacy just because you have a lot of good words, not true. But I also did have something going for me, which was this hand of compassion. The United States has long been the largest provider of food aid in the world. We provided food aid to the North Koreans and to the Taliban because no president would use food as a weapon. The United States, we were very grateful to the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief. We saved 25 million lives. We always spoke for the voiceless, whether it was the religious objector in China or the political prisoner in Cuba. And so there is that side of America as a great power that I think we're not spending enough time these days expressing. And I'll say something about Secretary Marco Rubio. He's doing a really good job. This was at one point his agenda. I would like to hear him speak more about that piece of it.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I don't know whether we're working with our timekeeping to Italian timekeeping or military timekeeping. We are technically over. Can we take one more question, or do you want to stop
one
now?
right there.
Yeah, we got one. Okay, very quickly. We'll go Italian at this point, okay?
Sure. I'm Gaurang Biani, an MBA student from India. I studied political science in Abu Dhabi, and my question was about how there are scholars like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs who argue that the Russian invasion of Ukraine can be traced back to NATO's eastward expansion.
Yeah.
So how would you sort of
Okay,
counter
I will
those?
answer that.
That's, hey,
This is-
this is going to be great, by the way. Thank you. All right.
I love those guys. I knew them. We were young arms controllers together, right? But this is reading Vladimir Putin's talking points.
Yes.
This is post hoc rationalization for what he has done. I spoke to Vladimir Putin a lot in 8 years. He kind of liked me. As I was a Russianist, we chat in Russian on the side. Not once did he mention NATO expansion to me or to George W. Bush. Do you think if he'd been really worried about NATO expansion, he might have found an opportunity to do that? The only time that it came up was if we wanted to put missile defense systems in Romania and in the Czech Republic and in Poland. That's the only time it came up. But when I hear this, I just think, you know, I guess Vladimir Putin just didn't care enough to mention it in 8 years, but all of a sudden, it's important to him.
And I'd say that's a brilliant answer. I'd also add to that, as someone who feels strongly about this, when Finland joined NATO, Vladimir Putin actually scaled down the forces on the border, didn't raise them, which tells you everything you need to know. And Finland is a lot closer to Moscow than Ukraine. So I strongly agree with that. But anyway, we are sadly out of time now. 3 things I've taken away from this panel, which has been phenomenal. 1, what we're seeing today in terms of the rise of geoeconomics and geofinance is not a blip, and it can't just be attributed to Donald Trump. It's been building for a long time and will not vanish again soon. 2, governments of all stripes are groping desperately to work out how to reformulate their ideas and policies for this new age. Yes, America's driving a lot of it, but American policy is certainly not perfect, to put it mildly, right now on that front. We've heard lots of criticisms. But for Europe and others, there is going to need to be a really serious rethink of how they imagine the world going forward. 3, for anyone studying business or economics, you need to rip up a lot of what you were taught on your CFA courses in the last 20 or 30 years and recognize that we are in a new world where we have to really learn that political risk is not something that just affects emerging market assets, as we used to think. It is now the new reality in a wider sense. And last but not least, I look forward to the Peace Summit in Greenland, chaired by Secretary Rice. Thank you very much indeed.